Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending our Curatorial Roundtable for the exhibition Awakenings, Art in Society in Asia, 1960s to 1990s, which actually opened to the public today. We are delighted to have with us this evening the curators of the show from all three institutions, Mr. Suzuki Katsuo and Mr. Masuda Tomohiro from the National Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo, Ms. Myungji from the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Korea, and from National Gallery, Singapore, Mr. Myungji, Ms. Adele Tan, Ms. Charmaine To, and Ms. Chen Jiayun. This evening's session will be moderated by Mr. Myungji, who is Senior Curator here at National Gallery, and he currently researches the art activities of Southeast Asia, focusing on the region's exhibition histories and artist collectives. I will now hand the mic over to him to start this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. So we are very delighted to have all of you joining us today. We know it's kind of like close to dinner time soon, so you're probably going to get quite hungry. But very nice for all of you to join us today. So with the panel, we have curators Suzuki Katsuo as well as Myungji. Suzuki Katsuo, of course, from MoMAT, and Ms. Bei from MMCA. And what we are going to do today is three of us will be giving a presentation, a short one to give you an introduction, a more in-depth introduction into the exhibition, focusing on specific works or specific topics that may not be kind of covered in the exhibition in terms of the wall text, but are certain other issues that we think it's interesting to discuss. That will be followed by the rest of the curators coming in to join us for a curatorial kind of a panel discussion. So it'll be more of a discussion format, whereby we'll discuss some of the other kind of topics or issues that we want to address, and this will be a nice platform to do that. And finally, of course, there'll be time for question and answer, and that's when we'll be very happy to take questions from all of you. Then, subsequently we'll close the session. So I'll now invite Suzuki-san to introduce the exhibition and also to start on his presentation. Thank you, Suzuki-san.
Hello, thank you, Eugene, for your introduction. And first of all, I offer my congratulations to National Gallery Singapore on the opening of Awakenings, Art in Society in Asia, 1960s to 1990s. And all the guests, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very happy to talk with you about our Awakenings exhibitions. Well, in Tokyo venue, last October, the exhibition was regarded as an opportunity to relativize post-war art in Japan in contrast with variety of contemporary art in Asia. Many audiences recognize that it's time to historicize post-war Asian art in a transnational framework based on resonances discovered in the exhibition. I hope this exhibition will also incite rich discussion here in Singapore. Awakenings focuses on complex relationships between art and society to understand how radical artists making art acted as a catalyst for transformation in society during one of Asia's most turbulent periods from the 1960s to the 1990s. This approximately 30-year period in Asian history saw all radical changes, including the ideological confrontations rooted in the Cold War, the outbreak of the Vietnam War, a rise in nationalism, rapid modernization, and a wave of democratic movement. In art, increased social tensions led to the transformation of form and function. Anti-modernist and anti-formalist criticism of abstract art, which had dominated the art world in many Western countries, also characterized this period. Such criticism called for restoration of art's referential relationship with reality, its critical function, and was also associated with the wide range of experiments across media, including the revival of representational painting, art objects, photography, video, performance, and installations. My presentation today will briefly talk about curatorial methodology of awakenings in a way different from the foreign constitution, composed of okay. The target is your PC. Okay. Yes, it works. Yes. I will talk about curatorial methodology of awakenings in a way different from the following constitution composed of 3 chapters: questioning structures, artists and the city, new solidarities. I would like to show you a framework to articulate radicalism in art in Asia with a fresh perspective, providing some topics for further discussion. In the existing art history of many countries in Asia, there seems to be a strong dichotomy between social realism and experimental art, or conceptualism. In order to understand the new tendencies of overcoming modernism or formalism in art from the 1970s onward, it has become a conventional way of telling art history of the concerned period of time. Let me show you some examples from awakenings that could be regarded as social realism, including the foreign works of Kaiserhaan group in the Philippines, Artist Front of Thailand, and Minjun art movement in Korea. Okay. On the other hand, those images are examples of experimental art. This dichotomy sometimes oversimplifies the relationship between art and society in such a way as the former is highly social and political, and the latter is less social or even apolitical. The term experimental art is very useful as it can comprehensively indicate a wide range of radical artistic practices such as happenings, interdisciplinary events, performances, and installations. But the term has been used consciously or unconsciously in concealing the political function of those practices. Awakenings tries to break this simplistic binary opposition in the writing of history of post-war art in Asia. Rather than focusing on a specific style, ism, or medium, Awakenings investigates local conditions where multiple expressive practices coexist in relation to each other, both in symbiosis or antagonism. In the 1970s and the 1980s, it was time for Asian artists to be able to access to a creative toolbox full of different ideas and styles, and to expand the possibility of expression by using those tools. This approach helps bridge the 2 different poles of radical art movement, namely social realism and experimental art. Okay. I would like to provide 2 concepts that help comprehensively grasp the multiple coexisting styles, as well as ramification of the resistance they have generated against modernism or socio-political conditions of modernity. The first idea is realism as an attitude. That was elaborated by Ushiro Shoji Masahiro, whom he organized the 4th Asian Art Show, Fukuoka, held in 1994. He argues that in Asian art from the late 1960s onward, 1980s onward, there has been a visible increase in works based on a critical social awareness, as well as those observing ordinary familiar incidents. He regarded it as a rupture from the objectives of modern art in Asia, seeking for national identity that tends to overemphasize Asianness. Quote, through works that convey an interest in society and a willingness to get involved in everyday reality, Asian artists have shown a stance that indicates their desire to proactively engage with and express the reality in which they live. This is the realism that emerged in Asian art in the 1990s. However, this is not the narrowly defined realism as a formal style or exacting mimesis, nor does it necessarily complement such realism. As opposed to realism as a style, this effort to squarely face reality is the common trend in Asian art during the period. And I call it realism as an attitude, unquote. Although we respect his idea to articulate the change in an artist's mind seeking for social engagement, it's time to revise it from the historical point of view, because this shift of attitude engaged much earlier than this shift of attitude emerged much earlier than the 1990s. Now we can say that realism as an attitude started to play an important role among the logical artists in Asia from the 1960s onward. The second concept is restoring the narrative in art. As you know, most forms of 20th century Western modernism radically rejected narrative art. The exponents of abstract, constructive, concrete, minimal, and conceptual art in the Euro-American were not interested in telling stories, but focused instead on the self-conscious work of art. It was not until the postmodern era that narrative elements began to appear again in visual art. I wrote an essay for the catalog about the rehabilitation of the narrative in the painting by the artists of Korea, the Philippines, and India. The essay argues that the re-emergence of the narrative elements in painting serves to reactivate a critical function of art. What is meant by narrative here, narrative here is neither the pictorial explanation of the story, nor the propagandistic transmission of a specific ideology. Rather, it is the cluster of meanings that are generated in the relations among forms that reference reality. Then, painting becomes a multifaceted text that waits creative interpretation by the viewer. Let us tell you about, Santos. Yes. Let me tell you about the paradigm shift in painting by picking up Pablo Bain Santos' manifesto, exhibited in Awakenings as an example. The artist established narrativity in painting by fashioning a rhetoric that contrasted the conflicts hidden in society with relation among forms in pictorial space through the strategic fragmentation of images. As a result, painting was no longer a window onto reality grounded in experiential vision. It became at once a visual and conceptual text that appealed to viewers' emotions and reason while transcending the constraints of ordinary space-time. This meant that painting could become an open-ended question, leading the way to the critical space that encouraged the subjective participation of viewer. In tandem with its formal experimentation in montage, this readable painting that surpassed outdated concepts of realism spread across Asia, an imaginative capacity for dynamically grasping reality. Such rehabilitation of the narrative in art against formalism was achieved not only in painting, but also in other expressions using performance and object. Fresh combination of everyday materials or human actions in a specific situation may create a new narrative based on local context. What is important is to pay attention to items in expression that could be transferred to visual sign. Those visual signs could produce a web of meanings that wait for creative reading of the viewers. I'm going to show you several comparisons of artworks of Awakenings in which we can see common or similar visual signs, leading to a a comment on social tension and friction that spread across Asia. First one, you can see the visual signs related to global capitalism. The second one, you can see the visual signs which comments on the physical restraint, desire for liberty. The next one, last one, you can see some visual sign, very strong visual sign of headless figure, which we can find some of the works in Awakenings. Conclusion of my presentation. It should be reconsidered if the dichotomy between social realism and conceptualism is still effective in understanding history of post-war art in Asia. Conceptual aspect of painting becomes more evident by focusing on the formal composition and its semiotic function. It is time to modify the term social realism. There are many examples in what we call experimental art that hold social criticism in a metaphorical way. We should pay attention to the political agency of experimental art, or should we reconsider the term itself? Transnational comparative study opens up a new way of understanding history of art in Asia by relativizing local and national art history. I hope we can continue such collaborative projects of comparative study of Asian art in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzuki-san. Next, we will have Ms. Bae Myungji, who will talk about artists and the city. Ms. Bae.
Hello, this is Myungji Bae of MMCA Korea. Thank you very much for National Gallery Singapore for preparing Curatorial Roundtable. It's a great pleasure to discuss with this exhibition with our curators and audiences. I will focus on our exhibition's chapter 2, the artist and the city, from now on. The Asian cities in the social and political context of Cold War were the center of modernization and rapid urbanization. In particular, economic development in Asia following decolonization was strategically achieved in line with nationalism and national reconstruction, or liberal democracy agendas under state leadership. It bears noting that the economic development in Asia during this period was achieved by authoritarian regimes such as those of Park Chung-hee in South Korea, Ferdinand Marcos in Philippines, and Suharto in Indonesia. With Cold War conditions, in effect, modernization of homeland in countries was also a state project using anti-communist ideology as a springboard for the future advances that economic development presented. As modernization proceeded, the cities of Asia became social and cultural places in abundance with consumer capitalism, mass commercial production, and all manner of mass media. Artists were fascinated by the dynamism of the newly emerging urban culture and spectacular visual expressions such as media and commercial new languages, while expressing a social consciousness in their work by adopting a critical perspective towards the more dysfunctional aspects of consumer capitalism, such as environmental issues, human alienation, commodification of women, and the destruction of tradition. It is also important to note that the consumer capitalism in Asia is related with the Western or American pop culture, which was introduced to Asia countries after World War II. Amid the social backdrop of Cold War ideology, Asian artists were profoundly concerned that consumer capitalism circulating from the West would destroy communities and harm the country's long-standing tradition. With his marketing series in 1980s, Oyun, a Korean Minjung artist, attempt to show the social contradictions of the multinational capitalism originating in the West, what the artist viewed as imperial capitalism. As can be seen in Marketing Hell 1, the artist drew a traditional Buddhist painting, bringing it into collision with the symbols of multinational capitalism, such as Coca-Cola logo, to satire South Korea society as a landscape where traditions were being destroyed and the environment contaminated by consumer culture. In this period, Coca-Cola was recognized as symbol of capitalism from America. In photo collage Coca-Cola Molotov cocktail by Korean artist Park Bul-dong, he combined the image of Coca-Cola bottle and the American flag, then cropped it into the shape of Molotov cocktail. The piece is read as a symbolic attempt to throw a Molotov cocktail at the multinational capitalism that infiltrated Korean society in 1980s. As such, in Sacred Road, Sacred Coke by Indonesian artist Aram Mainai, we can recognize Coca-Cola bottle on which a condom is placed, and it is on bottle covered by a concentric circle of soil and white power. The white power symbolized the drug cocaine, which could be known as a coke. Through coke, the artist would like to address the American imperialism, criticize addiction of Western capitalistic values. One of the critiques on urbanization by artists was environmental issues. The founder of the artist village in Singapore, the Dang Dao, performed they poached the rhino, chop off his horn, and make this drink in 1989. Mixing installation and performance together with the social narrative and ritualistic elements from traditional Chinese culture, these were called to mind the environmental issues resulting from contemporary consumer culture. This piece referred to the Chinese myth about the powers of rhinoceros horn, thought to have medical values, as well as the indiscriminate poaching and threat of extinct this belief have spawned. The change that took place in the world after 1989 with the Tiananmen Square incident, the fall of Berlin Wall, and the disintegration of Soviet Union ushered in wave of globalization and global capitalism. Chinese artist Wang Jin made a large-scale installation, Ice 96 Central China, showing his sense of alarm over the global capitalism rapidly infiltrating Chinese society in 1990s. In 1996, he built a 30-meter-long wall of ice modeled on the Great Wall in an industrial part of central Zhengzhou, placing inside of it over 10,000 consumer items such as watch, TV, and mobile phones, reflecting global capitalism and the capitalist desire as well. The result was an unexpected performance in which crowds of people smashed the wall of ice to acquire the items inside. Through this audience participatory work, the artist provided a realistic look at the dystopian process of tradition collapsing under global capitalism. From the 1960s to 1980s, Asian cities were spaces through which the state exercised power through diverse methods such as institution, culture, and media. Asian cities were major settings for the defense of anti-communist, pro-US liberalism, and the places where state authority was channeled. In that period, Asian artists ventured into the actual cities, streets, subways, and parks, transforming public places into settings for art, and deployed radical gestures to narrow the gap between art and reality. Cities began to replace traditional white cube as alternative art spaces where artists could commingle with and the audience and their audience, with their audience, and infiltrate their everyday life. In particular, the performance in the city street were a form of bodily resistance against the institutions and authorities that operated on those bodies. One representative example of the street performances may be the collective performances by Japanese artist group Zero Jigen. Their performances were sort of wild gestures of resistance against the national project towards accelerated economic growth and internationalism in 1960s and shared social contexts such as anti-harmful protests and anti-war demonstrations in the 1980s. For example, naked walk gas mask ritual staged by members wearing gas masks on the street in Shinjuku contained criticism of the Vietnam War. The cleaning event by Japanese artist Performance Group High-Res Center is also a good example of how performances held in the public spaces can resist the city controls by the state. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics globally announced Japan's comeback from the defeated nation and served as a flare that earned Japan's recognition as an advanced nation. Before the Olympics, maintenance work to refurbish Tokyo was carried out forcibly at the national level. In the middle of Tokyo Olympic, key members of High-Res Center dressed in white cleaners' uniforms and took to the street of Ginza. Through the act of cleaning, they mocked and lampooned, satired the city beautification project. During the 1960s to 70s, Seoul was not only a symbol of modernity, but also a setting of censorship and controls based on a rigid ideology, advocating military dictatorship and anti-communism. The regime controlled newspapers, broadcasting, and all other media while cracking down on hippies, long hair, and even young women wearing miniskirts on the street of Seoul in the name of establishing discipline in the national spirit. Young Korean avant-garde artists adopted street performances as a way of criticizing this conservative social landscape and the establishment culture and arts exemplified by the National Art Exhibition. For example, Murder at the Han River by Kang Guk-jin, Jeong Kang-jae, and Jeong Chan-seung, and the funeral ceremony of the establishment art and culture by the first group were acts of cultural criticism in some of Seoul's most representative urban spaces, including the Han River, Sajik Park, and the gate at Ganghwamun. In an attempt to bury and murder the old institutions, costume, and cultural establishment that had dominated those public settings. Over the 86 years from 1948 to 1987, repressive politics persist in Taiwan under martial law. Taiwanese artist Chen Chie-chen's Dysfunction No. 3 performed on a famous public street in Ximanding in 1983 with 5 people wearing clothes resembling prison uniforms and execution hoods, was a kind of protest against the condition of martial law by Chiang Kai-shek. And I maneuvering myself around a performance by Thai artist Basan City Cat involving the mad chasing of money in downtown Bangkok, served as a kind of institutional critique, satiring the American capitalism that had infiltrated the new urban space of Bangkok. One of the art strategies for agitating urban life in that period was to contrast the images of economic development, urbanization, and human alienation very dramatically. Dede Spuria, a key member of the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru new art movement in Indonesia, emphasizes a dramatic contrast between spectacular image of the city and one of the urban poor peoples in his painting. In doing so, he offered a critical assessment of class issues and human alienation that had emerged from urbanization advanced by authoritarian regime. And just, okay, I have to, yes, I have some times, 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah. As a byproduct of urbanization and consumer culture, mass media became important during this era. Art became a way for artists to re-examine the politics of mass media, because television, newspapers, and other Asian media were often used to sustain dictatorial governments and bolster state ideology by subtly manipulating the public. In this context, mass media were often tightly controlled and under close surveillance. Artists like Korea's Song Neung-kyung and China's Zhang Peri drew on mass media characteristics to ironically criticize the politics of media. In conclusion, as a locus of the urban revolution, Asian cities from the 1960s frequently transformed the everyday urban culture, visual experience, mode of living, and cognitive system. Especially for an Asian artist, the city was also geopolitical spaces rather than neutral places. Cities were artistic sources and strategies for dynamic activities that would spur a re-examination of subjectivity, ordinary life, capitalism, and social political issues in Asia. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Bei. So my name is Eugene, and I'll touch on the third chapter of this exhibition, looking at new solidarities. And what I want to highlight here is really to look at intersecting contexts across Asia. And here we look at a connection of student protest movements across Asia from the 1960s to the 1990s, which is the period of study in this exhibition. And I realized that, we realized through our research that the student protest movements were particularly important because we think about the artists today, of course they are now in their 60s and 70s, they were actually young students back then in the 1960s and 70s, particularly after 68. Of course, you know, the important radicalization of student protests in Europe had a major impact on protest movements in Asia as well. Including Southeast Asia. So for example, if you look at the Malari incident in Jakarta in 1974, or the University Thammasat massacre that happened in 1976, or the first quarter storm in Manila, and also the whole range of student protests in the Rangoon University, now known as the Yangon University in Myanmar. So these were just examples of student protest movements happening across the 1960s. And when we look at also the different authoritarian regimes across Asia, we see an interconnection between these student protests that were happening. They were kind of resisting the forms of authoritarianism across Asia in that same period. And of course, there was also at the same time artist-student radicalization across Asia through the formation of artist collectives. So for example, Kaiserhaan, or Solidarity in the Philippines, which was a kind of left-leaning organization of artists who were social realists, as what Suzuki-san had also presented earlier. Anak Alam in Malaysia, the Gangao Village Art Group in Myanmar, and also looking at exhibitions like Towards a Mystical Reality in Malaysia, as well as the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru, or the New Art Movement in Indonesia. So looking at the art and social movement, particularly across Asia, one of the ideas that we had, and what Ms. Bei earlier talked about, was how artists reclaimed public spaces, particularly the street. Of course, Ms. Bei has talked about High Rate Center in their work and how they kind of performed in Ginza, kind of like the cleaning as a kind of humorous or satirical take on the Tokyo Olympics at that time. Streets became a very important way in which artists were kind of reclaiming it. By reclaiming the streets, they were also challenging new ways of thinking about art, and also kind of new ways of interacting with the public through the street as a central way in which, and I quote Henri Lefebvre, in the street, a form of spontaneous theater, I become spectacle and spectator and sometimes an actor. So the street is a place to play and learn. The street is disorder. This disorder is alive. It informs. It surprises. Revolutionary events generally take place in the street, unquote. So the street was an important site in which artists were intervening, and in which they were also kind of forming new relations with the public. So I'm going to focus on one specific artist collective in this exhibition, the United Artists Front of Thailand. And they were formed in 1974, and they organized a billboard cutout exhibition in 1975 in the streets of Rajadamnern Avenue. And now that's a very important street because that street is where the Democracy Monument is, and it leads to the Thammasat University and then to the Grand Palace. So this is what I will say as probably the most symbolically powerful and important street in Thailand. And of course, many protests today still continue to form the Democracy Monument. So if you look at the series of student protests in Thailand as a case study from 1973 to 1976, these are images of the Thammasat University. It looks pretty much the same today if you go to Thammasat University in terms of the campus grounds. It was really a site of student protests, particularly because Thammasat University was the first public university in Thailand, whereby anyone, regardless of your class, could have a university education. It was quite different from Chulalongkorn University, which was really an elite, a university for the elite. I went to the Thammasat University archives, which is a great archives, which is not very well known. And I found there a lot of these publications of books on Ho Chi Minh or the ideas of Mao Zedong. And all these books were actually translated into Thai. So these are actually part of what we call the 10-cent books, because these books were actually read by Thai students and they were translated by them, not to make money because you can make money with 10 cents, but really to transmit and disseminate these ideas to the broader population in Thailand. So, of course, during the Thammasat University massacre in 1976, it resulted in the killings of many of these students who were protesting against the military regime and fighting for democracy in Thailand. So many of these books that I found in Thammasat University archives were destroyed because many of them were burned in Thailand. So these are, again, more examples of these books that thankfully are still in the Thammasat University archive. So this exhibition has also resulted in kind of research that we've been doing to uncover this important wealth of materials in these various archives. So the United Artists Fund of Thailand produced a manifesto as well, which was something that this exhibition looked at, and how they were kind of in their manifesto looking at, and I highlight here in red, big people or little people or the fight injustice in society. So these are kind of common issues that many of artist collectives in Asia, for example, including the New Art movement, were interested in kind of how art was not serving the elite and art was really about serving the people in a way of kind of thinking about how can we make society more equal or trying to address certain social political conditions. So we made a research trip among all the curators from the 3 museums to the 14th October Memorial in Bangkok. So I strongly encourage you to go there. It's not usually listed as a tourist place to go to, but I think it's an important site that celebrates and commemorates and remembers the democracy movement in Thailand. And during that time when we were there, we found that they had an exhibition at the memorial, the Minjung movement in South Korea, where they were actually linking to the Gwangju uprising in Korea. So already we see the kind of connections that this exhibition tries to make. That's already, we see it as well at the 14th October Memorial, how they saw the connection of a kind of a desire for democracy and the importance, of course, in the role of artists in that. So this is the Rajadaman Avenue. You can see the Democracy Monument. As I said, it leads to Thammasat University and the Grand Palace as well. So coming back to the cutout project, Billboard Cutout Project in 1975. So these are examples of the murals that were actually displayed in the middle of Rajadaman Avenue. So it was almost like a ritualistic procession, as you can see over here, where they displayed these billboards that were attacking, the kind of taking on a anti-neo-American imperialism, particularly because of the Vietnam War. And they were against American bases being used in Thailand as part of the war. So you can also see images of the billboards with the loudspeakers that were playing kind of rural folk music. So it's interesting because that form of rural Thai folk music was introduced into an urban space in the streets. And these paintings were actually collaborations between artists, students, and anyone who was there to help make these paintings. All these paintings were destroyed, unfortunately, and they were remade and displayed currently at the 14th October Memorial. So those that you see right now are on loan from the memorial, and they are 1/4 the size of the original, because the originals have all been destroyed. So here we see, these remade paintings at the 14th October Memorial. I'll just quickly run through so that you can have a look at them, because not all of these paintings have been loaned and shown in this exhibition, but we have also showed the posters that they made. This was a time before social media, and the way to really galvanize people was through posters, where to meet, for the protest to take place and so on were done through posters at that time. So these are just translations because they're all in Thai. So this one talks about imperialist Americans, drive them out. Or urgent, America is damaging Thai sovereignty. So this is the translation over here. And this connects, of course, with what Ms. Bae was talking about, the fourth group in Korea. They were also kind of, intervening in the streets, and by reclaiming it, challenging, it also challenges the kind of authoritarian regimes at that time. So it's the same also for Jirojigan, in which they had these ritualistic processions that take place in the streets of Tokyo within the broader context of the anti-AMPO movement, which was really the kind of protesting against the agreement between Japan and America for America to build military bases in Japan. Also, there's an example of a work by Lin Yilin, safely maneuvering across the Linghe Road. So a Chinese contemporary artist kind of moving the concrete bricks over a road in Guangzhou. So again, intervening in the streets, disrupting traffic, and in that way kind of changing, or rather offering new ways that we can think about how artists can reclaim public spaces. We also wanted to include an important, artist collectives, and Samat is an important collective that's based in New Delhi, and it really celebrates the life of Safdar Hashmi, who was murdered in 1989. He was a theater practitioner. He did street theaters in New Delhi, and he was championing for kind of, against the caste, the different caste movement and the different castes in India, and also against kind of corruption as well. But eventually he was killed by his opponents, and Samat was set up to commemorate, the life of Safdar Hashmi. So these are kind of installation views. Maybe you did have a chance to see Awakenings in MoMAT. So this was when the exhibition opened in October in Tokyo. And finally, in New Solidarities, we look at gender and society, and we look at comparisons between Korean artists who formed the October group, a feminist group of artists who dealt with gender issues, with Philippine artists like Julie Luch, questioning what's the concept of beauty itself. And finally, we end with Reinterpreting Histories, whereby we have artists, who kind of relook and remember these important historical events, ending with, of course, FX Hasono's work, which ends with a question. What would you do if these crackers were real pistols? So I will end with thinking about moments of relationality in terms of how artists have reclaimed public spaces like the streets as a kind of strategy. And they adopt different strategies. It could be play, rituals, and ways in which they kind of activate the spaces. That's no longer in a passive way, but including audiences in a very active, participative way. And how we can think about the shift to the marginalized as a model for identification, in order to diversify our perspectives. This is really an idea from Chen Guan-Sing in his book, Asia as Method. And how do we think of the radical potential of the city as a site for space and action, where the everyday meets revolution, and I quote that from Henri Lefebvre. And can the everyday transform itself into something more different in terms of different forms of the participatory? And lastly, I think we need to think about art for whom? And are these different forms of solidarities, were they able to produce these new subjectivities and kind of participatory ways of making and thinking about art? So I'll end with a quote by Chen Guan-Sing. I'm thinking about the potential of Asia as method, and how by doing a comparative approach, which is really the methodology of this exhibition, we're able to look at different or produce different points of references that produces new forms of subjectivities as well. Thank you. So we'll now invite the curators to start our curatorial panel discussion. So can I invite Masuda-san, Adele Tan, Charmaine To, and Jia Yun to join us, and we will have a discussion before we open up to the floor for questions. So I'll start off the first question. Considering that this exhibition has been collaborative, and the curators work together to develop the curatorial framework and also to conduct the field work together. And it took more than 4 years actually to complete our curatorial research. So I'm wondering is perhaps, this is a good opportunity for the curators to kind of reflect on our curatorial approach and our methodology, because this was an approach that we decided to take, in which we would kind of conduct our research together, to meet the artists together, to actually meet the artist curators, the historians, to see the artworks together as well. We thought that was an important way in which we have a common understanding of the works, which will help in our discussions and to develop the curatorial framework. So perhaps I can ask Suzuki-san to start us off, if you can, to kind of reflect on this approach, and perhaps also if you think we could have adopted other ways to kind of to work.
Very big question. Well, I try to answer your question briefly. About 4 years ago, when we started this project, we discussed over and over again about the methodology of curating this project, this exhibition. As you know, there are several types of transnational exhibition, especially organized by the big museums in the West. All of us studied such past exhibitions and try to find the best way to fit in our project. For example, you can imagine such type of exhibitions using the specific style or isms that were conceived by the Western art world. For example, global conceptualism or global pop art, such that. And also, about 10 years ago, those three national museums, at the time, National Gallery Singapore was not inaugurated, and at the time, SAM was joining our project. We organized an exhibition entitled Cubism in Asia. In this exhibition, the curators used Cubism and how the Cubism received in Asia and changed in the local context. So this is a very useful way to understand and to make comparisons beyond the national border. But we decided not to take such a method, because in that case, we need to, use the term conceptualized by the West. In this exhibition, we would like to discover how the Asian artists try to go beyond the influence of the modernism and try to find a new way to expand the artistic expression in the context of local situation or local historical situation or local social situation. We decided not to use the specific style or specific isms. What we tried to focus on the Awakening exhibition is the artistic attitude or artistic spirit or artistic strategy to confront the status quo at the time. So I think we took a long time to decide the methodology of the curating this exhibition. Maybe somebody following my comment.
Thank you. Ms. May, would you like to add?
Yes, we spent many years to accomplish this exhibition. I'm so pleasure to see the end of the exhibition in Singapore. This exhibition is a kind of post-colonial project, and we did not intend to make one single image of Asia confronted to Western. So we would like to make a multiple and the images of the Asia by inside of our curators, inside of the Asia, not by the outsider of the Asia. I think it is very good point, important point to make a exhibition strategy in our exhibition. And to make this end, we make a decision to have the transnational framework and the cultural comparative study to make multiple stories in Asia. I think it is very important strategy in our exhibition, the framework. So in the end, we make many kinds of the stories and narratives, including questioning arts and city capitalism and agitating urban life and mass media and solidarity and feminism and reinterpreting history. And so we can just see the Asia in very multiple the point of view. So I think the strategy of the transnational framework and the comparative cultural studies is very important and effective way to see the Asian scene in many ways.
Adele, Shamin? No? Nothing further to add? Okay, so, and perhaps we are also very curious because we saw some installation views of awakenings at MoMAT and also at MMCA, of course, National Gallery are here and we can see it. And this exhibition has traveled from venue to venue, so the two different venues. So can we also share perhaps how the exhibition has changed through each venue and also the reception of awakenings in Tokyo as well as Japan? So maybe Masuda-san, would you like to reflect on that? Reception. Yeah, the reception.
So reception of audience.
Yes, the audience. How did they receive the exhibition?
Well, I don't know about the difference between the. I don't know about difference how. A difference between Japanese reception and the Singaporean and the Korean reception on this show. Well, especially in Japan, well, なんかあるかな、レセプション。はい。はい。はい。いや、ベトナムがないとかそういう話ですけどね。
Do you need a translation?
That's okay.
Maybe Suzuki-san, would you like to help to
なんかあります?
chime in on this?
Well, actually, this exhibition, full of the information about the Asian avant-garde, was a little bit difficult for the Japanese audience. We tried to show them the background information, how the artists try to break the norm, and how the artworks was related to the local context. But for the Japanese audience, they know much about avant-garde movement in Japan, but not about Asian avant-garde. So for most of the Japanese audience, this exhibition was almost the first time to see and think about how the Asian artists try to open the new door toward the contemporary art. And so this exhibition forced the audience to face the artworks, to think behind the art, and reconstitute the cognitive map of to understand cultural movement or social movement. And so, but on the other hand, we received a very positive response. Those who looked closely, deeply, the awakenings, the artworks exhibited in awakenings, they got some clue to think about the Asian histories, which was almost unfamiliar with the Japanese audience. So I realized that the Awakenings exhibition proposed artworks can feed historical imagination or geographical imagination or geopolitical imaginations to create a new understanding with each other. So I think this is the very positive response that I got in the Tokyo venue.
Thank you. I remember something. So a scholar gave me some comment with a relatively negative tone. She claimed the title, this awakening. So she questioned, she claimed, who awakened? And she said, oh, the artists always keep awakenings. So she accused me to awaken is, so the curator awaken. So she is accused of me to do so. But that's true. Actually, in Japan, we have been grasping on their own art practice in Japan, comparing basically Western art. So in this mean, our criteria is deeply based, so deeply rooted on the Western canon. So during this research trip in East Asia and South Asia to find out avant-garde movement in 1960s and 1990s, honestly speaking, for me, I was a little bit embarrassed to see those artworks because I always question, I always doubting to myself, what is the interesting point of this artwork? Or is it art? But step by step, through the research trip, I understand their artworks have urgent contexts, reflecting on their local context or reflect on their everyday life urgencies. So for me, the research trip was kind of the way to deconstruct my colonial mind, reflecting on the studying Western canon. So for a scholar, awakening, the term is a critical, so she accused of me the term of awakenings. But for me, the awakening means very positive meaning. Thank you.
Thank you, Masuda-san. How about Ms. Bay, in the case of Korea, how was the reception like, both from scholars and art critics, as well as artists, who went to the exhibition.
And first of all, the Korean representative 3 art genres, including 월간, 미술, monthly art, and art in culture and art world, featured this exhibition very in deep dimension. The art expert and art historian curators in Korea recognize this exhibition as the first opportunity to shed light on Asian contemporary art from 1960s to 1990s in comparative way and with the way of the transnational framework. It is the first very important reaction because the Asian exhibition that had been held in Korea usually focused on from late 90s to early 20s or over 1990s. So it is such a blank between 1960s to 1990s art scenes in Asia. So it's our good opportunity and good, very important way to see that that period. It's first reaction to our journalists and art experts, and the audience, the public, think this exhibition is a little bit difficult to understand, and they said that why Asian stories and why Asian history are always sad, why always traumatic. So in some reaction to the public, and some public said that we have very traumatic history, such as Gwangju Uprising, the very huge massacre. And they also astonished and surprised by that. So we can compare the Gwangju Uprising and the Korean Minjung artwork in 1980s with Thailand's the Artist Front, and with the Philippines Kaiserhaan. And many audience were so astonished by the kinds of huge Minjung, huge Asian social engaged art movements. They can understand the social engagement in very deeply, comparing the other Asian countries' social engaged art movement is a very important reaction, as I think, from the public.
Well, we are still getting kind of reviews and responses in the case for Awakenings at the National Gallery Singapore. But that's something we'll also reflect on, as this exhibition unfolds. And last question before we open up to the floor, and I'm hoping that they'll, Charmaine and Johnny, maybe can think about this, because it's a bit fun as well. If we were to develop kind of different themes for this exhibition, what would they be? Is there something that we would have wanted to put in, but we could not, but did not, but a certain particular theme or topic that we would have wanted to kind of include? Yeah? Any? No? How about?
So some of you will know that my area of research is photography. And in the early parts of the curatorial meetings, I think one of the strategies that we thought about looking at was the idea of documentary as a strategy. And so this was when we were still working out how to curate the show and what works were going to be included and what would not be included. And this was, so we had this discussion about how documentary in Asia was actually different from the way we interpret documentary photography. For example, war photography that you tend to associate with Life magazine or the Magnum photographers and so on. And I also still remember that one of the photographers we really wanted in the show was Ismail Hashim, who subsequently didn't, I mean, we were unable to include it into the exhibition. But that's something I think that I mean, myself and Suzuki-san, we've had this conversation about potentially kind of really thinking a lot more about the idea of documentary photography or just documentary as a strategy, not necessarily in photography within Asia and how it might differ from traditions of documentary elsewhere. On the other hand, we have included some documentary work. It's just that it wasn't a specific section in itself, but it kind of got scattered throughout the show.
Well, I think personally, as an art historian, I'm very interested in materials. So having worked on the rematerialization section, you know, I have no further wishes. But I think what was very important for me and for us for this exhibition was, you know, to also kind of draw attention to the agency of the artist who's making, and the fact that so many artists, you know, in Asia are kind of actively thinking through new and different strategies to go about this process. And in a sense, sometimes, you know, the act of making is a very kind of quiet and contemplative one, but when you put them all together, you know, there's kind of like this charge that happens between all of them. And you really pick up on a lot of these kind of resonant strands where, you know, artists are looking for meaning, you know, outside the parameters and outside like the conventions of what has been taught to them or what has been prescribed prior. Yeah.
Thank you. So, how about Masuda-san, Suzuki-san, Ms. Bei? Do you have, maybe we can take maybe one more? One of you would like to take this question? No? Yeah, okay. All right, so I think we are also kind of overrunning, so we like to kind of open it to the floor. And if you have any questions, you know, please just raise your hands. We have a mic that will be passed to you in front. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Lily. I live here. Congratulations and welcome to Singapore, for those of you who are not from Singapore. I congratulate you that 4 years is a long time to have this pulled together. My question is around ideology and the role that played in this particular time period. I think you talk about it, and I'm trying to sort out in my head what is so special about these 30 years, and what was the ideology that was kind of driving some of these artists to create work that is actually different. Ms. Bei, you talked about this is post-colonial period, and the flavor or the sensibilities taken in this show talks about the post-colonial. But I think one thing I'm sort of missing, although I haven't seen the show yet, is that you haven't really decolonized anything. That's a big fat word now on decolonizing. So many of your thoughts, many of your references are still from the West, right? So the ideology that was driving some of these artists, you know, there was, for example, the whole leftist, the whole left movement. I mean, is there anywhere in there in your show that says that the inspiration, the ideological inspiration to the artists came from a place in Asia rather than the West? For example, were a lot of these artists looking at China, you know, as a place, and so the inspiration. So can you talk about ideology a little bit more?
Yeah, actually, so in my presentation, sorry, I can't find that slide now, but I was looking at the Thammasat University archives, and there you can see, I was actually interested in your question as well, but to find concrete evidence is not easy. But there we have the circulation of these books, the translations of Marx, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, as you can see here. It's literally, it's on the book cover. So these ideas were actually transmitted through the translation. We're not talking about translation, it's an important process as well. in which these ideas or ideologies were transmitted throughout. At least in the case of Thailand, I'm not sure that this was necessarily so for the entire Southeast Asia or even Asia, but I'm sure that these different forms of this did transmit around through translation of this. Oh, that.
In Japan, Mao's thought was very influential at the time. And in this exhibition, we introduced some of the manifestos written by the Asian artists. And the key term is art for people. So this is coming from the, maybe one resource of this concept is Mao Zedong's textbook. Mao Zedong's book, red book. Yeah. So art for people is, well, it's belief for the artist working at the time, and also it is ideology at the time.
So in Korea, we have very special social political situation because we divided in North Korea and South Korea. And in Korea, mentioning the ideology of the Mao Zedong or the communist ideology is prohibited. We can be present without judgment if we in the Cold War period, not now. But Minjung artists in the 1980s, inspired by Gwangju uprising, is a little bit related. It's something related with deeply related with the kinds of the Mao Zedong theory or ideology that art helped to be spread into Minjung people, not for the just elite. It's a very important and very big mythology, the belief that they have to follow. So it is a special case in a very delicate situation in Korea because we are still in the era of Cold War because we have the North Korea.
Would you like, anyone like to add? No? Oh, yeah. The next question? Yeah, over there. This one. Alfian. We'll swing back to you. Yeah.
Hi. So one question that I have is regarding the periodization. Yeah. So between 60s to 90s, because when I see awakenings and then that time period, I can see that, for example, some places in Asia did go through a process of liberalization and democratic transition. So one can say Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, moved out martial law, etc. Even Indonesia in the late 90s. I'm wondering though, what does it mean to do this exhibition in an authoritarian country like Singapore that has not undergone that kind of a democratic transition, right? Because, and whether that kind of bracketing over like the 60s and 90s is a way to avoid addressing the fact that Singapore is still very deeply authoritarian. And in the year 2018, last year, sent an artist to jail for 2 weeks, Silan Palay, for doing a work called Interrogation of a Mirror. And of course, one cannot include that work in the exhibition because it sort of like falls outside that period. So I'm wondering why that kind of period, and also that question of like, I just felt this sense of disquiet as I walked through the exhibition just came from it just now when there are all these signs saying, oh, there are all these countries that were authoritarian, that had authoritarian regimes, and there was zero mention of Singapore. Yeah, and it so happened that during that period they were authoritarian, but a lot of them went through democratic transition. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you for your question. You might have missed maybe one section on the woodcut movement, where we did a comparison between the Singapore woodcut artists who were very active in the 50s and 60s, and Hong Song Dam, it's a woodcut artist from the Minjung movement. And one of our aims was really to make this comparative kind of research into looking at how the woodcut movement in Asia was particularly important. And of course, the woodcut movement was born out of artists who were concerned about social political issues, which was why they produced works that address or raise issues concerning the social injustices or the difficult conditions, which is very similar when we compare between the artists from Singapore, the woodcut artists from Singapore as well as Korea. Now, as for the periodization, let's give you an example. There are others in the exhibition. In terms of the period, why 60s to 1990s? This is actually a historical exhibition. So it looks at this period because of the Cold War context that binds the histories of Asia. Of course, one could have done an exhibition that extends up to now, but because the Cold War was so significant in how, in kind of binding the histories of Asia, in which artists were also kind of responding to. They were not just in their studios painting, but responding to the social political conditions created by the Cold War. And even closer to home, it was the Vietnam War, which is strange why it's called a Cold War, because it was very hot in Southeast Asia. It was never cold. It was cold in Europe and America, strangely, but it was very hot in Southeast Asia. People were literally dying in Southeast Asia. So that was how we kind of thought about that periodization in looking at the 60s to the 1990s. Yeah, I hope that's okay with an answer. All right, we'll swing back to you as promised.
Hi, I've waited so long for this show. I'm really excited. Personally, so I grew up in Indonesia. I'm Indonesian. And I think this show is so scary because it's 30 years of history and it's 12 countries. And even though I see a lot of really familiar works from Indonesia, it's still like quite terrifying to I haven't seen it yet, but I'm scared oh, what if I don't know this work or that work? Yeah. But anyway, there was a lot of discussion about separating the discussion, the terms that the Western would use, which I really appreciate. But I understand that it's really tough, and then I realized that maybe it's because we're all bound because we speak English. I'm sure all of you also discuss your strategies and everything in English, right? So I'm just wondering, could you elaborate more on your research methodologies? So, because even me, when I read research papers, I'll be too lazy to read Indonesian, so I'll read in English. And the English text mostly, a lot of them are written by non-Indonesians, for example. Yeah, so I'm wondering whether you speak to translators or what kind of texts and methods do you use? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, because you spoke pretty fast, not your fault. But it's okay, I will take your question. Translation was a key point actually in our discussions. And in fact, one of the things that we thought about was how terminologies in art tend to be Western-centric. And we use terms from Western art history primarily. Of course, Suzuki-san mentioned about Cubism, minimalism, these are Western terms. And which was why we did not have another ism as a title for exhibition. So for better or for worse, we settled with Awakenings, and that's another story how we settled on this title. I think in the end, we were looking very closely at the artists' manifestos, because this was a period whereby artists produced manifestos across Asia. And of course, they were written in different languages. And when we studied and we translated, and there's this book called Artist Manifestos. I strongly recommend you buy it. They translated this 100 manifestos into English from all over the world. And we look at comparatively, we found that, for example, what Suzuki-san mentioned about art and the people. And this term, the people, became something interesting in which it became quite ideological as well. So these were kind of terms that were translatable. But how about the terms that are untranslatable? And there are also terms like that. So how do we deal with the untranslatability of certain terms? So I don't think we have managed to resolve that per se, but we tried to look at languages in the various, of course, terms in different languages. And we tried to go back to how the artists themselves, in their own language, whether it's Korean, Japanese, Indonesian, Thai, and so on, kind of meant in their own way, that's not necessarily related to the Western terms that were used. So for example, the conceptualism used in the West was very different from the conceptual used by artists in Southeast Asia, for example. So, so these were ways in which we tried to kind of create a more nuanced or calibrated terminology, borrowing this term from Marianne Pester-Roche's, in how we tried to look at terms in their own context, as what Masuda mentioned, rather to their own local context, rather than a kind of locating it within the Western understanding of these terms. Thank you. Maybe we can take one more question. Is there anyone who would like to ask us? We have one. Yeah, the gentleman behind.
It's almost a follow-up to the first two people that had questions. I'm glad that you mentioned that this is a historical exhibit, so it's from the 60s to the 90s until the fall of the end of the Cold War. I was wondering if you can put in context the happenings of what's going on right now in Hong Kong, and as that's like a sort of, I would say, reminiscent of what's they were fighting for back in the 60s and 90s. And also, I can't comment for Singapore, for Taiwan, or for Korea, but it seems like there's been less engagements with artists currently, and I wonder if you can maybe comment on why you think that may be. Is it because we as a society have been less, maybe care less about politics today, or if that's what you see?
Well, I think the first question about what's happening, for example, in Hong Kong, I think if you look at this exhibition, I think you realize that all these important kind of historical events that happened continue to resonate today. If you can look at the Cold War context, for example, as I mentioned earlier, and student protests, it's not a new phenomenon. It has always happened throughout Asia's history. So we see those connections in what's happening now. I think that is what makes this exhibition so relevant today, because many of these issues that we thought we settled in the 70s and 80s are actually coming back. They were never settled. So we thought the Cold War ended, for example, but did the Cold War really end? We thought that colonialism ended, for example. Did it really end? So these are kind of continued issues that have never been resolved, and it wasn't resolved in the last generation. So can this generation, find ways in which to resolve this, or engage with it, or find ways around it? I think this exhibition opens up, because artists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think this exhibition shows the changing role of artists. They didn't see themselves as passive anymore. They were very active, early kind of engaged with these issues, which comes back to your second question, why? It's a tough question to answer. Because most of us, we are here as curators and art historians, and somehow, we study them art historically, but of course we don't go out there to tell the artists, why aren't you guys, being more social, politically active? That's not our role, but looking at the 60s and 70s, especially the 60s, didn't everything happen in the 60s almost? The civil rights movement, also, gender equality, all that, so many things happened in the 60s. And I think artists really were responding to that period, because all these things happened in the 60s. And therefore, the works that they produce, at least those works that we showed in this exhibition, clearly, that they were very actively engaged with it through their practice. So as for why now, I think it really depends on individual artists. We have entered a period whereby practices have become so pluralistic. There are so many issues that artists wish to address. Social, political issues are just one aspect of what artists do. In fact, this exhibition, as what Suzuki-san also mentioned, the kind of conceptualism and kind of social realism are not binaries, and how the conceptual can also be socially engaged. So these are ways in which we need to think of art in a more expanded and open way. And perhaps that's how we can also understand how artists are dealing with politics, perhaps not so directly, but developing different strategies of their own to address these issues. And then this is our task, to understand these strategies and to, in the case of an art historian, to historicize them. Yeah, thank you. Right, so thank you all for coming today, and a round of applause to the whole curatorial panel. Thank you to Masuda-san, Suzuki-san, Ms. Bei, Adele, Charmaine, and Jiayun. Yeah, and thank you all for coming and joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the exhibition. Yeah, thank you.